July 1947. New Delhi. Inside a colonial-era room built for officials who never truly belonged to the land they ruled, the air feels heavy enough to press against the lungs. The temperature has climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the heat is not dry or forgiving. It clings to the skin, mixing with dust, sweat, and the thick moisture of the monsoon season. Ceiling fans spin endlessly above, their blades creaking as they push the same hot air in lazy circles, offering movement but no relief. The walls seem to sweat along with the man seated at the desk. At the center of the room sits someone who looks profoundly misplaced, as though he has wandered into the wrong world entirely. He is dressed in a heavy woolen suit, the kind tailored for the gray, damp chill of London mornings, not for the punishing furnace of an Indian summer. The fabric clings to his body, darkened with sweat. His collar is stiff, his tie tight, and his posture rigid, as if discipline alone might shield him from the environment closing around him. His face is flushed. Beads of perspiration roll down his temples and soak into his shirt. His skin prickles with heat rash, and beneath the discomfort lies something worse. He is ill. A severe stomach infection grips him relentlessly, forcing him to rush to the bathroom every few hours, leaving him weak, dehydrated, and exhausted. Sleep comes in fragments, broken by pain, noise, and the constant hum of the fans overhead. Spread across the desk before him are stacks of paper that represent the fate of millions. There are maps, old maps, some so worn that their edges curl upward, their surfaces faded and dusty. Several are torn at the corners, their creases deep from decades of folding and unfolding. Many of them have not been updated in 20 or even 30 years. Rivers wander across the paper, railways cut through provinces, and borders that once seemed permanent are marked with thin, confident lines. Beside the maps lie piles of census data, columns of numbers meant to summarize human lives into percentages and totals. There are letters as well, and petitions, pleas written in careful handwriting or hurried scrawl, sent by people the man has never met and never will. Each letter carries fear, hope, desperation, or anger. Each one argues for a future that cannot coexist with the future someone else is demanding. The man seated in this stifling room is Sir Cyril Radcliffe. He is not a soldier. He is not a geographer. He is not an expert on South Asia, nor has he spent years studying its religions, cultures, or languages. He is a lawyer, trained at Oxford, respected for his sharp legal mind and his reputation for integrity. He understands contracts, torts, and property disputes argued calmly in the orderly courts of England. His world is one of precedent, logic, and carefully reasoned judgments delivered in measured tones. Yet here, far from the calm of British courtrooms, Radcliffe has been handed a task so vast and so destructive in its potential that it borders on the absurd. He has been given a job that would normally require years, 5 years at the very least, of detailed surveying, political negotiation, and local consultation. Instead, he has been told to complete it in 5 weeks. His assignment is brutally simple in wording and catastrophically complex in reality. He must take a pencil and draw a line across the Indian subcontinent. That line will divide a land of roughly 400 million people into 2 new nations. It will determine where India ends and where Pakistan begins. It will decide the fate of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs who have lived alongside one another for centuries, sharing markets, streets, festivals, and even bloodlines. With a few strokes of graphite, Radcliffe must turn neighbors into foreigners and homes into hostile territory. Perhaps the most terrifying detail of all is this. Before stepping off the plane in Delhi just days earlier, Sir Cyril Radcliffe had never set foot in India in his life. To understand how such an impossible and reckless situation came into existence, we must step back and examine the condition of the British Empire in the year 1947. Empires, we are often taught, end in dramatic fashion. They collapse amid revolutions, heroic struggles, and grand declarations of freedom. Flags are torn down, statues toppled, and history turns on a single, explosive moment. But empires do not always end with glory or resistance. Sometimes they end with exhaustion. Sometimes they end with panic. Britain had emerged victorious from a Second World War, but victory had come at a staggering cost. The nation was financially ruined. London still bore the scars of the Blitz. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Food and fuel were rationed. Bread, coal, and basic necessities were carefully measured and distributed. The British public was weary, drained by years of sacrifice, loss, and uncertainty. There was no appetite left for empire. The idea of sending British sons to die in a distant colony to police violence between religious factions held no appeal. India, once celebrated as the jewel in the imperial crown, was now viewed through a very different lens. From the perspective of London's new leadership, it had become a burden, a financial and political liability, rather than a source of pride. The Labour government, led by Prime Minister Clement Attlee, had little interest in maintaining Britain's overseas possessions. Their focus was domestic recovery. They wanted to rebuild homes, restart industries, and care for a population battered by war. The empire, with all its costs and complications, stood in the way of those goals. India, in particular, appeared increasingly dangerous. Sectarian violence was rising. Political tensions between the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League were intensifying. Strikes, protests, and riots hinted at something far worse on the horizon. British officials feared that if they remained, they would be dragged into a civil war they could neither afford nor control. The decision was made. Britain would leave India, and they would leave quickly. But withdrawal presented a terrifying dilemma. Simply packing up and departing would not bring peace. It would almost certainly trigger full-scale civil war between Hindus and Muslims. To avoid this, British planners concluded that the subcontinent had to be divided before independence. Two nations would be created, a Muslim-majority state called Pakistan and a Hindu-majority state called India. The problem was obvious and fatal. No one knew where the border should be. This is where the tragedy of incompetence truly begins. The British government needed someone to draw the line, but every possible choice seemed flawed. If they appointed an Indian leader, the opposing side would immediately accuse them of bias. If they selected a British administrator with years of experience in India, that person would have friendships, loyalties, and enemies among the local population. Familiarity itself would be treated as corruption. So the British arrived at a dangerous conclusion. They decided that ignorance was the same as impartiality. They wanted someone with no connection to India, no emotional investment, no personal history. A blank slate. Someone who could not favor one side over the other because he knew nothing about either. Their search led them to Sir Cyril Radcliffe. Radcliffe was known in London as a man of principle, discipline, and legal brilliance. He followed instructions precisely. He believed in procedure and order. Most importantly, he was entirely unfamiliar with India's geography, cultures, religions, and demographics. To British officials, this ignorance was not a weakness. It was a qualification. When Radcliffe was first approached, he hesitated. He asked how long he would be given to complete the task. He was told he would have several months. Tight, perhaps, but manageable. Out of a sense of patriotic duty and professional obligation, he accepted. He packed his bags and boarded a plane for Delhi. The illusion shattered the moment he arrived. Radcliffe landed in New Delhi on July 8, 1947, and was immediately confronted with the reality of the situation. Waiting for him was Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India. Mountbatten was charismatic, aristocratic, and deeply connected to the British royal family. He was also a man racing against the clock. Mountbatten had already made a dramatic decision of his own. Without consulting Radcliffe, he had advanced the date of independence. Britain would no longer leave in mid-1948. Instead, power would be transferred on August 15, 1947, barely 5 weeks away. When Mountbatten explained a revised timeline, Radcliffe was horrified. He did the calculations silently. 36 days. That was all the time he had to divide one of the most populous and complex regions on Earth. Radcliffe protested. He explained that drawing a border through densely populated provinces required extensive fieldwork. Villages needed to be visited. Infrastructure had to be studied. Rivers, canals, railways, and power grids were interconnected in ways maps could not fully show. Above all, people needed to be heard. Mountbatten was unmoved. Delay, he insisted, was not an option. Violence was already spreading. Every additional day increased the risk of total collapse. Separation, however crude, was the only hope of preventing an even greater catastrophe. Radcliffe was trapped. He could not refuse. He had already accepted the mission. He had been placed, at least in theory, between India and anarchy. And so, carrying that unbearable responsibility, Sir Cyril Radcliffe stepped into the sweltering room where a pencil, a map, and history awaited him. Sir Cyril Radcliffe was installed in a quiet, isolated bungalow within the Viceroy's estate, a place meant to provide security and focus, but which quickly became a kind of intellectual prison. The building was surrounded by manicured lawns and guarded gates, yet inside it felt increasingly claustrophobic. The isolation was intentional. British officials believed that distance from Indian society would preserve Radcliffe's neutrality. In reality, it stripped him of context, human connection, and understanding. To assist him, a boundary commission was formed. On paper, it appeared balanced and fair. 4 judges were appointed, 2 Muslim judges who supported the creation of Pakistan, and 2 Hindu judges aligned with the Indian National Congress. Their role was to advise Radcliffe, to provide local insight, and to ensure that the process maintained an appearance of legitimacy. In practice, the commission was dysfunctional from the start. Each meeting dissolved into argument. Every proposal sparked accusations of bias. When Radcliffe suggested a boundary that favored one side demographically, the opposing judges accused him of betrayal. When he attempted compromise, both sides rejected it. The judges did not act as neutral advisors. They acted as representatives of competing national visions. Each came with predetermined conclusions and red lines that could not be crossed. Radcliffe soon realized the grim truth. The judges canceled each other out entirely. They were not helping him draw a border. They were ensuring that he alone would bear responsibility for whatever line emerged. Frustrated and overwhelmed, Radcliffe began withdrawing. Meetings became shorter. Eventually, he stopped consulting the judges altogether. He retreated into his room, shut the door, and turned fully to the maps. Those maps would become his world. They lay spread across tables and floors, weighted down at the corners to prevent them from curling in the oppressive humidity. Many were official ordnance survey maps produced by British surveyors in the 1920s. They showed rivers, railway lines, district boundaries, and major towns with precise, confident markings. On paper, they appeared authoritative and complete. But India was not static, and the maps were frozen in time. In the decades since those surveys had been conducted, the subcontinent had changed dramatically. The population had exploded. New villages had emerged, sometimes overnight, formed by families clearing land, digging wells, and building homes wherever survival allowed. Vast irrigation projects in Punjab had transformed dry plains into fertile farmland, creating entire agricultural communities that did not exist when the maps were drawn. None of this appeared on the paper before Radcliffe. The maps did not show who lived where. They did not show that a canal might be owned by a Hindu landlord but relied upon by Muslim farmers downstream. They did not show that a Sikh shrine stood beside a Muslim graveyard, or that a single marketplace served multiple religious communities. They reduced human complexity to lines, dots, and shaded regions. To Radcliffe, exhausted and pressed for time, these maps became the final authority. They were objective, unemotional, and legible. They did not argue or plead. They did not cry. And so, he trusted them. When Radcliffe saw a river, he saw a natural border. Rivers, after all, had served as boundaries for centuries in Europe. They appeared clean and logical. What the maps did not tell him was that many Indian rivers shifted course during monsoon season, sometimes moving miles over a few years. Nor did they show that communities on both banks often belonged to the same clans, spoke the same dialects, and married across the water without thought. When he saw a railway line, he saw infrastructure, not lifelines. He did not see the markets that depended on those tracks or the villages that would be stranded if the line crossed into another country. A straight pencil stroke could sever trade, food supply, and access to medical care in an instant. Radcliffe's detachment, once seen as impartiality, began to harden into abstraction. Under intense pressure, he reduced a living land into solvable problems. He looked for clean divisions where none truly existed. He sought symmetry and balance on paper, even when reality was asymmetrical and chaotic. Psychologically, the burden began to crush him. Radcliffe lived in constant fear of assassination. He understood that whatever boundary he produced would anger millions. He stopped leaving the bungalow except when absolutely necessary. He refused social invitations. He avoided conversations with Indians, terrified that even listening to their stories might compromise his neutrality, or worse, make the consequences of his decisions impossible to ignore. He ate alone. He worked alone. 16-hour days became routine. He stared at the maps until the lines blurred and his eyes burned. The relentless heat drained him further, and the dust seeped into every crevice of the room. His weight dropped rapidly. His illness worsened. At night, he wrote letters to his stepson in England. In those letters, stripped of official language and public composure, the cracks began to show. He described the heat as appalling, so intense that it destroyed all energy and clarity. He wrote about racing against time, about knowing that people would suffer as a result of his work. These were not the words of a cruel man. They were the words of a bureaucrat trapped in a moral nightmare. Radcliffe was not wielding a weapon, yet he felt as though he had been handed a loaded gun and told to fire blindly into a crowd. The problems he faced were not theoretical. They were immediate and agonizing. Nowhere was this clearer than in the western province of Punjab. Punjab was the breadbasket of the subcontinent, a land of rich soil, sprawling wheat fields, and a complex network of rivers and canals. Its population was deeply mixed. Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs lived throughout the region, often in close proximity, often interdependent. The Sikhs posed Radcliffe's most difficult challenge. They were a distinct religious community with their own language, traditions, and identity. Their spiritual heart was the city of Amritsar, home to the Golden Temple. Yet Sikh landholdings were scattered across central Punjab, without a clear territorial concentration that could be carved into a separate state. There was no scenario in which the Sikhs could win. If Radcliffe assigned their lands to Pakistan, Sikhs would become a vulnerable minority within a Muslim-majority nation. If he placed them in India, the western districts of Punjab, predominantly Muslim, would be severed from the rest of Pakistan. Every possible line split the Sikh community. Delegations of Sikh leaders came to plead their case. Bearded elders described sacred shrines, ancestral lands, and generations of history rooted in the soil. Some begged, others threatened, many wept openly. Radcliffe listened politely, but when he returned to his maps, the problem remained unsolvable. The shrines were scattered. The communities were interwoven. There was no circle he could draw around Sikh identity, only a straight line. Eventually, Radcliffe made a decision that looked reasonable on paper. He awarded the great city of Lahore to Pakistan and the holy city of Amritsar to India. The map appeared neat and balanced, but on the ground, it meant catastrophe. A Sikh farmer living 10 miles west of Amritsar found himself suddenly declared a foreigner in his own home. The pencil had spoken. In the east, the province of Bengal presented a different, but equally devastating dilemma. Calcutta, now Kolkata, was India's industrial and commercial heart. Its jute mills, factories, and massive port connected eastern India to global trade. While the city itself had a Hindu majority, the surrounding countryside was overwhelmingly Muslim. The Muslim League demanded Calcutta for Pakistan. Without it, they argued, East Pakistan would be economically crippled, reduced to swamps and rice fields with no industry or port access. The Congress Party countered that Calcutta was central to Hindu Bengali culture and could not be surrendered. Radcliffe faced an impossible choice. Giving Calcutta to Pakistan would likely spark Hindu riots. Keeping it in India would condemn East Pakistan to long-term poverty. He weighed economic logic against demographic reality. In the end, he awarded Calcutta to India. At the time, it seemed like a reasonable compromise. In the decades that followed, it would contribute to the chronic underdevelopment of East Pakistan and, eventually, the birth of Bangladesh through another violent partition. But Radcliffe did not have the luxury of foresight. He was balancing ledgers under a ticking clock, making decisions measured in minutes that would echo for generations. As August 15th approached, the atmosphere inside the bungalow grew manic. Deadlines closed in. Rumors of violence filtered through even the guarded walls. Radcliffe worked faster, more recklessly. Districts were decided in moments. Percentages were skimmed. Strategic considerations sometimes outweighed population data. One such decision involved the district of Gurdaspur. Gurdaspur had a slight Muslim majority, which by the rules should have placed it in Pakistan. But it also controlled critical road access to the princely state of Kashmir. Giving it to Pakistan would isolate India from Kashmir entirely. Radcliffe hesitated. He considered irrigation headworks, military logistics, and future stability. Then, with a single motion of his pencil, he assigned Gurdaspur to India. That stroke of graphite would ignite wars that are still unresolved today. But Radcliffe did not think in centuries. He thought in days. He thought in hours. He thought about surviving until Tuesday. As the deadline loomed closer, Sir Cyril Radcliffe's world shrank to the size of his room. The outside reality of India, its streets, its people, its rising tension, became something he sensed only through fragments. A distant shout carried on the wind. An urgent report delivered by an aide. A brief conversation overheard in a corridor. He was physically present in Delhi, yet emotionally and intellectually sealed away from the country he was dividing. Night after night, Radcliffe sat alone at his desk. Power outages were frequent, and when the electricity failed, he lit candles and continued working by their flickering glow. Shadows danced across the walls as his pencil moved steadily across the maps. In those moments, the silence was suffocating. There were no advisors he trusted, no one to share the weight of his decisions. Only paper, ink, and conscience. He knew he was failing. Radcliffe was intelligent enough to understand the limits of what he was doing. He knew the border he was drawing was crude, rushed, and deeply flawed. He understood that it cut through villages whose inhabitants slept peacefully, unaware that their citizenship was being rewritten hundreds of miles away. He admitted later that, at one point, he nearly destroyed the maps entirely in a fit of rage and despair. The temptation to tell Mountbatten to find someone else was overwhelming. But Radcliffe was a product of the British civil service. You did your duty. You did not complain. You finished the job. So he kept drawing. He drew the line through the heart of Punjab, slicing through farmland, canals, and towns that had functioned as single economic units for generations. He drew it across Bengal's marshes and rivers, indifferent to seasonal floods and shifting terrain. He drew it through neighborhoods, sometimes dividing a single street between two countries. In Lahore, the line cut through a mental asylum. The front of the building ended up in India, the back in Pakistan. The inmates, Hindu and Muslim alike, were separated according to religion, as if madness itself now required nationality. The absurdity of the moment captured the insanity of the entire process. By August 12, 1947, the work was finished. Radcliffe was physically and emotionally shattered. He gathered the maps, the census tables, and his final recommendations. Two jagged lines stretched across thousands of miles of territory, lines that would define the modern political geography of South Asia. With them, he walked into the presence of Lord Mountbatten. Radcliffe expected immediate publication. He assumed that once the borders were announced, people would know where they stood. He believed British troops would be deployed along the boundary to maintain order and prevent violence during the transition. However imperfect the border was, clarity and preparation might still prevent catastrophe. Instead, the story took a darker turn. Mountbatten examined the maps carefully. He saw instantly what Radcliffe already feared. No matter how the lines were drawn, outrage was inevitable. The Sikhs would feel betrayed. Muslims would rage over Gurdaspur. Hindus would protest in Bengal. The border was a political and human time bomb. Mountbatten then looked at the calendar. Independence Day was August 15th. He wanted the ceremonies to succeed. He wanted flags raised, crowds cheering, bands playing, and speeches celebrating the end of empire. He did not want riots, panic, or mass displacement to overshadow Britain's final moment in India. So Mountbatten made a decision that would cost millions their lives. He locked the maps in his safe. The Radcliffe Line would not be published until August 17th, 2 days after independence. Britain would be officially gone before the consequences were revealed. The chaos, when it came, would belong to India and Pakistan alone. It was an act not just of incompetence, but of evasion. As the sun rose on August 15th, 1947, millions of people awoke to freedom and confusion. The British flag was lowered. New flags were raised. Fireworks exploded over cities. Politicians delivered speeches filled with hope and pride. Across India and Pakistan, independence was celebrated as a moment of rebirth. But in the borderlands of Punjab and Bengal, no one knew which country they lived in. Police officers did not know whose laws to enforce. Soldiers were uncertain which commanders they now served. Villagers knew a line had been drawn, but no one could tell them where it was. Fear spread faster than facts. Rumors swept through towns like wildfire. One rumor claimed a village had been assigned to Pakistan, sending Hindus into panic. Hours later, a counter-rumor insisted the village belonged to India, terrifying Muslims. Each new whisper undermined trust and stability. Uncertainty created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped men who had been waiting. Local militias, criminal gangs, and extremist groups on all sides saw opportunity. They spread the message that survival required purity. If the border was unknown, they would create their own, with fire and steel. Communities were told that the only way to be safe was to eliminate the other. Sir Cyril Radcliffe watched the independence celebrations from a distance. He knew what was hidden in Mountbatten's safe. He understood that the joy he witnessed was fragile, temporary, and doomed. The cheers would soon become screams. He felt like a criminal. Radcliffe packed his bags quietly. He did not attend the announcement of the border. He did not wait to see the outcome of his work. He wanted to leave India as quickly as possible, to put distance, geographical and emotional, between himself and what was about to unfold. On August 17th, as Radcliffe headed toward the airport, the maps were finally released. By then, it was already too late. The first refugee trains were leaving the stations. The first fires were burning. The greatest migration in human history had begun. When the borders were announced over the radio and printed in newspapers, the suspense ended. But what replaced it was far worse than rumor. Across Punjab and Bengal, millions realized at the same moment that they were on the wrong side. A farmer who had tilled the same land for 40 years discovered his fields were now in a foreign country, defined by a religion he did not practice. Sikh farmers in West Punjab learned they now lived in Pakistan. Muslim craftsmen in Old Delhi learned they now belonged in India. The logic of partition demanded movement. But movement meant abandonment. Homes were left behind. Livestock wandered unattended. Crops rotted in fields. Ancestral graves were deserted. At first, many refused to believe it. Surely the line would change. Surely minorities could stay. Surely reason would prevail. It did not. What followed was not random mob violence. It was organized, systematic, and prepared. Militias had stockpiled weapons. Rifles left over from the war, swords, spears, and homemade explosives. When the announcement came, cleansing began. The message was clear. Leave or die. Villages were surrounded at night. Drums beat as a warning. Fires were set to block escape. What happened next defies easy description. This was not war between armies. It was neighbors turning on neighbors. People who had shared weddings, festivals, and daily life. The brutality shocked even veterans of World War II. Radcliffe's lines had severed transport networks. Railways, once symbols of connection, became corridors of death. Refugees flooded the stations, clinging to roofs and hanging from doors. Trains were packed so tightly that people suffocated before departure. But the worst horror awaited on the tracks. Trains crossing the new border were ambushed. Tracks were sabotaged. Armed men boarded carriages and moved methodically through them. When the trains arrived at their destinations, doors opened to silence. Bodies spilled out. These were the ghost trains. A train full of murdered Hindus arriving in Amritsar. A train full of slaughtered Muslims arriving in Lahore. The black lines Radcliffe had drawn on paper became rivers of blood. And the roads offered no escape. People walked. They formed massive refugee columns called kafilas, some stretching 50 miles long. Entire populations moved on foot, barefoot, starving, and dehydrated. Children were carried on shoulders. The elderly collapsed by the roadside and were left behind. Mothers faced impossible choices when their bodies could no longer carry their infants. These columns were attacked as well. Mounted men charged into defenseless crowds. Women were abducted by the thousands, used as instruments of humiliation and revenge. Violence became a language spoken fluently by all sides. 15 million people crossed the borders in a matter of months. It remains the largest mass migration in human history. As the subcontinent descended into violence, a haunting question echoed across the chaos. Where was the British Empire now? Where were the forces that had ruled India for nearly 2 centuries, boasting of law, order, and stability? Where were the soldiers who were meant to oversee a peaceful transition? The answer is one of the darkest chapters of the entire tragedy. Britain still had roughly 50,000 troops stationed across India in the summer of 1947. Among them was the Punjab Boundary Force, a specially created military unit whose explicit purpose was to manage the border transition and prevent violence. On paper, the resources existed to reduce the bloodshed. In reality, those resources were deliberately withheld. Orders from London and from Lord Mountbatten were unambiguous. Protect British lives. Ensure the safe withdrawal of British personnel. Do not intervene. British commanders were instructed to remain neutral observers. They were told not to involve themselves in communal violence, even when massacres unfolded within sight of their barracks. There are documented accounts of British soldiers hearing screams from nearby villages as men, women, and children were slaughtered, while doing nothing because their orders forbade action. For 2 centuries, the British officer class had presented itself as the ultimate guardian of order in India. In 1947, that claim collapsed entirely. The same empire that had imposed ruthless discipline during minor uprisings now stood aside as entire regions burned. Officers packed their belongings, cricket bats, silverware, framed photographs, while the country dissolved around them. This was the second great betrayal. The first had been the reckless drawing of the border. The second was the refusal to stop the killing that followed. While Punjab bled, Sir Cyril Radcliffe was no longer there to witness it. He had already left India, desperate to escape the consequences of his work. By the time the worst reports began reaching Britain, he was back in London, staying in a flat in Mayfair, one of the most comfortable and insulated neighborhoods in the country. Each morning, Radcliffe opened the newspapers. And each morning, the horror deepened. He saw photographs of endless refugee columns stretching across the landscape. He saw vultures circling above exhausted crowds. He read reports of cholera outbreaks in overcrowded camps where clean water was non-existent. He watched death toll estimates climb relentlessly. 200,000, 500,000, 1 million. Eventually, historians would settle on a figure close to 2 million dead. 2 million lives extinguished because of a line drawn in 36 days. Radcliffe was not indifferent. He was shattered. Friends later recalled that he barely slept. He became withdrawn, haunted, and visibly shaken. He understood, with terrible clarity, that every hesitation of his pencil had carried lethal consequences. A line drawn through a canal could cut off water to a village and doom it to thirst. A road severed could trap a community and leave it defenseless. The weight of it crushed him. When the British government attempted to pay him his fee, £3,000, a substantial sum at the time, Radcliffe refused. He returned the money, stating that he could not accept payment for work that had resulted in such suffering. It was an act of conscience, but it brought no comfort. The dead did not return. The wounds did not heal. Radcliffe never returned to India. He knew he could not. Millions cursed his name, even if many did not know his face. He resumed his legal career, eventually becoming a peer of the realm. He lived a long life, dying in 1977, but he never escaped the shadow of the map. Years later, he admitted to a journalist, "I suspect they'd shoot me if I went back." He was likely correct. Yet the legacy of the Radcliffe Line extended far beyond personal guilt. The rushed, careless nature of the border created permanent geopolitical fault lines that still define South Asia. None proved more dangerous than Kashmir. Because Radcliffe had awarded Gurdaspur to India, India gained road access to the princely state of Kashmir. When the Maharaja hesitated over accession, India was able to send troops quickly. Pakistan contested the move. War followed almost immediately. Had that single district been assigned differently, Kashmir might have joined Pakistan automatically. The history of the region, and perhaps the world, would have changed. Instead, India and Pakistan fought their first war within months of independence. They would fight 3 more in the decades that followed. Eventually, both nations developed nuclear weapons, aimed across the very border Radcliffe had drawn. What was meant to bring peace instead produced permanent hostility. Beyond geopolitics lies the deeper, human legacy. Partition is the founding trauma of modern South Asia. In Punjab and Bengal, nearly every family carries a memory. A grandfather remembers walking for days under the sun. A grandmother remembers a sister who never arrived. Stories of survival coexist with stories of unbearable loss. Culture itself was divided. Urdu poets found themselves in Pakistan, while their readers remained in India. Punjabi singers lost half their audience overnight. Shared traditions fractured, separated by barbed wire and suspicion. The arbitrary line hardened into an absolute reality. Today, the border between India and Pakistan is one of the most heavily militarized zones on Earth. At night, it glows, a bright, unbroken line of floodlights visible from space. That glowing scar follows the precise path of Sir Cyril Radcliffe's pencil. Why did it happen this way? Some argue it was pure incompetence, heat, haste, and exhaustion. Others see something darker. Certain historians suggest Britain deliberately left chaos behind, believing a divided subcontinent would be easier to influence from afar. A weak Pakistan could serve as a client state. Endless conflict would prevent regional unity. These theories are unsettling, but the evidence forces uncomfortable questions. Why choose a man who knew nothing? Why impose a 36-day deadline? Why refuse to use troops to stop mass murder? At best, it was criminal negligence. At worst, calculated destruction. The story of the 36-day map is a warning. It warns us about the danger of distant power making decisions for people it does not understand. It exposes the arrogance of empires in decline. Radcliffe was not evil. He was a symbol of a system that had stopped caring. He treated nations like puzzles to be rearranged. But nations are not puzzles. They are people, soil, water, and memory. When you cut the land, you cut the people. Radcliffe returned to England, where borders have been settled for centuries, where fields remained unchanged for generations. He left behind a wound across Asia that has never healed. The violence eventually subsided. The anger did not. The suspicion did not. 2 million dead did not return. Their bones lie in Punjab's fields. Their ashes drift in its rivers. And the line remains, jagged, accidental, and arbitrary, deciding the destiny of more than 1 billion people. The violence of 1947 did not end neatly. There was no clear moment when the killing stopped and peace began. Instead, it faded slowly, unevenly, leaving behind a scarred land and a traumatized people. Refugee camps became semi-permanent cities of grief. Children grew up among tents and ration lines, carrying memories of horror they did not yet understand. Survivors rebuilt their lives, but they rebuilt them on silence. Across India and Pakistan, people learned not to ask too many questions. Families avoided speaking about what had been lost, because loss was everywhere. Entire villages had vanished. Entire lineages had been erased. Some stories were too painful to tell. Others were too dangerous. In both countries, the new governments wanted unity, not remembrance. Looking forward was encouraged. Looking back was discouraged. Yet the past never truly stayed buried. In Punjab and Bengal, memory lived on in fragments. A grandfather would pause while telling a story and fall silent. A grandmother would clutch a photograph and refuse to explain who was missing. Songs carried sorrow between the lines. Poetry hinted at homes left behind, at streets that could never be walked again. Partition did not just redraw borders. It reshaped identity. People who had once identified by village, trade, or language were now defined by nationality and religion. The fluid, overlapping world of pre-1947 South Asia hardened into rigid categories. Suspicion replaced familiarity. Borders replaced relationships. And the Radcliffe Line became more than a boundary. It became a wound that never closed. Over time, fences rose along it. Then barbed wire. Then concrete posts. Finally, floodlights. At night, the border glows, an unbroken chain of light slicing through fields, rivers, and villages. From space, it is visible as a bright scar across the subcontinent. That glowing line traces the exact path of a pencil held by a sick, exhausted man in a room in Delhi. Sir Cyril Radcliffe did not intend to create this legacy. He was not driven by hatred. He did not seek fame or power. He was a professional doing what he believed was his duty. But intention does not erase consequence. History judges outcomes, not excuses. Radcliffe believed neutrality meant distance. The British government believed speed mattered more than care. Mountbatten believed appearances mattered more than preparation. Together, they created a disaster that no apology could undo. The question remains, was this tragedy inevitable? Some argue that partition, however painful, was the only solution. They claim the violence would have happened regardless. Others insist that a slower, more thoughtful process could have saved millions. That consultation, updated data, and honest use of military force might have prevented the worst atrocities. Then there are those who believe the chaos was useful. A divided subcontinent ensured weakness. Rival states would spend their energy fighting each other instead of challenging former colonial powers. Pakistan could serve as a strategic ally. India, consumed by internal trauma, would turn inward. Whether intentional or not, the result aligned disturbingly well with imperial interests. The truth may lie somewhere in between. What is certain is this: the Radcliffe Line was drawn with breathtaking carelessness for something that governed human lives. It was a border created without accountability. No referendum, no local consent, no mechanism for revision. Once drawn, it was treated as sacred, and people paid the price. India and Pakistan went on to fight 4 wars. They continue to face off across the same line, armed with nuclear weapons capable of destroying cities in minutes. Generations have grown up knowing only hostility. A border meant to end violence instead institutionalized it. Yet beneath the politics and military posturing lies a quieter truth. The people on both sides are still deeply connected. They share food, language, music, and history. They laugh at the same jokes. They mourn in the same ways. The soil does not change at the border. The rivers do not stop flowing. The wind does not recognize nationality. The division exists because men decided it should. This is the final lesson of the Radcliffe Line. Borders are not natural. They are not inevitable. They are not drawn by God. They are drawn by human beings, often under pressure, often far from the consequences of their choices. And when those choices are rushed, careless, or arrogant, the cost is paid in blood. Sir Cyril Radcliffe wanted to go home. That desire, to finish the job, to escape the heat, the illness, the responsibility, may have mattered more than any map. His pencil shook not because he hated the people of India, but because he was overwhelmed. He wanted the ordeal to end. And so, he drew the line. He returned to England, to a country where borders were ancient and stable, where land did not shift beneath one's feet. He lived out his days haunted by what he had done, aware that his name would forever be associated with suffering on a scale few individuals have ever caused. But Radcliffe was not alone in guilt. The empire that appointed him, the leaders who rushed him, the officials who hid the maps, the soldiers who stood aside, all share responsibility. The story of the Radcliffe Line is not just a story about 1947. It is a warning that still matters today. Around the world, borders are still being contested, redrawn, and enforced. Powerful people still make decisions in distant rooms about lands they barely understand, and ordinary people still suffer the consequences. So the next time you look at a map and see a clean, sharp line separating India and Pakistan, remember what lies beneath it. Remember the room in Delhi. Remember the heat, the dust, and the outdated maps. Remember the pencil moving too fast. Remember the millions who ran, the trains that arrived silent, and the families that never reunited. Remember that history is not abstract. It is human. And if this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you see borders differently, then there are many more untold histories like it. Stories hidden behind lines on maps, waiting to be understood. If you want to explore them, if you want to understand how decisions made in quiet rooms shape the fate of millions, then stay with us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. History is not just the past, it is a warning. And the next line has not yet been drawn.